The weather was perfect that third day in May as the boy, energetic and youthful, walked out the door of his childhood home with an ample bit of courage coupled with excitement, but shadowed with a slight hint of fear. It was on that day the boy became a man. The beautiful morning in May was his 21st birthday, and life seemed so full of possibilities. And like a pit bull full of spit and courage to face the unknown, regardless of what may come, he trotted into a day of boyish vigor, morphing into manhood. It was a typical spring morning, and not a cloud in the sky. Just the kind of day for an adventure. And not just any adventure. Today, Hayden Hopkins would celebrate his birthday with a gift that most boys his age would certainly envy if offered half the chance. Today would be the day when Uncle Red would finally allow Hayden to drive his treasured 1964 Chevy Corvette, a priceless gem of Americana, one that still dominates the dreams of car lovers both young and old alike. He arrived at Uncle Red's house about 9 a.m. that morning with unbridled anticipation. Uncle Red, his mother's brother, 3 years her senior, met him at the door with a list of what not to do while driving behind the wheel of his classic automobile. Rules of the road spelled out by a man who treated his car better than he treated his wife. Hayden, hearing only about half of the lecture, couldn't wait for Red to hand over the keys. After absorbing an eternity of instructions, he finally found himself sliding into the driver's seat of a classic piece of machinery. Where would he go? What would he do? He was forbidden to allow any of his hoodlum friends, as Red called them, to even sit in the car, let alone ride in it. Red's strict orders. So, he just drove in the direction the car was facing, eastbound. Soon, he found himself cruising through the campus of Southern Methodist University and figured that was as good a route as any while the warm wind caressed his youthful face, bobbing to the music on the radio, which was blaring loudly from the convertible classic. Soon, he connected to the dreaded 75 Central Expressway, 6 lanes of southbound traffic, speeding toward the very center of Big D. Like a bead of water into an ocean, he too blended into the endless stream of steel and rubber floating toward the heart of the city. One either needed to be a part of it or be run over by it, and if he wasn't careful, he could easily be the latter if he dared slow down or take his eyes off the 80-mile-an-hour traffic. Hayden was as giddy as a child as his swelling pride rose up once he discovered he was the envy of most drivers along the highway, gawking at the vet with smiles, envy, and even occasional thumbs up. He found it almost impossible to keep his foot light on the throttle, but even in his youthful venture, discipline would keep him safe from such dangerous thoughts. And still, where to go? It didn't matter. He had all the day in the world. That day belonged completely to him. Before long, Hayden found a deep desire to get out of the city, and since he was southbound on Interstate 35, he figured he'd just keep going. It was near noon by now, and he was getting hungry while taking Highway 287 Exchange, next town, Waxahachie. He'd heard of the small town, but had never been there, and his stomach convinced him that stopping for a burger anywhere was a must. Route 287 business was his next exit west into the middle of the historic North Texas village. Fertile fields of forests of pecan and oaks soon gave way to historic stately homes on either side of the road. He was amazed as he passed one historic home after another, giving his imagination a hint of life in the old days. The pride of the village was a beautiful red stone courthouse right in the middle of the town square, surrounded by unique 19th century commercial architecture. He soon found a quaint little restaurant right across the street from the courthouse and had a bite to eat among the cut limestone walls lined with black and white pictures and decor from a time when cotton was king and Waxahachie, Texas thrived by the profits of it. Once Hayden had devoured the best home cooking he'd ever had away from his mother's table, he decided to cruise the Victorian neighborhoods and admire the historic homes. He was mesmerized as he drove past one beautiful house after another, each outlined with bright colors, gingerbread trim, large wraparound porches, and stately yards manicured to perfection. Early afternoon was looming as thoughts beckoned his return to Dallas, when suddenly the car sputtered. His heart sputtered along with it. Not only would a breakdown maroon him in unfamiliar territory, but Uncle Red specifically instructed him not to take the car very far from the neighborhood. He just knew he would be in some serious trouble if Uncle Red found out. Another sputter, a cough, and that was it. Nothing. The car died and rolled to a stop, and Hayden found himself stranded without any idea of what the engine looked like, let alone what could be wrong with it. Once again, he tried to start the car, but to no avail. Over and over, he turned the key, but the engine just churned and smuttered. So naturally, he got out of the car and lifted the hood, glancing at the motor. Not that he had any idea what he was looking at, but that is what men were supposed to do. He was no mechanic. Not knowing what to do next, Hayden instinctively started jiggling wires and checking for loose parts when his hand unintentionally came in contact with a hot radiator cap. "Ouch!" he shouted as he jerked his arm back, striking the support rod, dropping the hood directly on his head. Frustrated, he let out an expletive that would embarrass anyone in mixed company. But he was not in mixed company, or so he thought, until he heard the sweetest voice on God's earth.
"You break down?"
she yelled from the safety of the porch. It was only then that he realized his car had stalled in front of a beautiful Victorian house with a large wraparound front porch. Sitting in a rocking chair on the porch was one of the most beautiful girls Hayden Hopkins had ever set his eyes upon.
"What's the matter with your fancy car?"
she yelled again. Hayden found himself awestruck and suddenly unable to speak.
"Are you deaf or something?"
"No," he replied, somewhat insulted and embarrassed all at the same time. "It just died." At that, she stood up and walked down the sidewalk toward his car. Hayden was instantly smitten with the girl as if bewitched, even though she seemed a bit feisty in her initial tone. It mattered not, for she was as beautiful as a goddess as far as he could tell.
"Is it yours?"
she asked. No. It's my Uncle Red's," he stuttered. "We live up in Dallas, and, well, he lets me drive it."
Do you always tear up your Uncle Red's stuff? Just kidding.
She said with a smile.
You want to use our phone to call your uncle?
I guess so, he reluctantly replied, knowing that the phone call could spell out the end of driving the car forever.
Well, coming up to the porch, and I'll ask my mother if you can come inside and use the phone.
Hayden had his cell phone in the car, but ignored it, if doing so would lend him any prospect of being in the company of such beauty.
Mama!
She yelled into the back of the house.
There's a boy who needs to use the phone. His car broke down in front of the house. What boy?
Came a woman's voice from the same direction.
Just a boy.
The girl yelled back.
He just needs to use the phone. All right.
Yelled her mother.
But don't go any further into the house. I just waxed the dining room floor, and I don't want anyone walking on it for a while. Okay, Mama.
The girl replied, motioning Hayden into the large foyer lined with dark oak, wainscoting upon a crimson carpet that covered the hot opine flooring. He found the home elegantly fashioned in comfort, but oddly retrospect in decor. The young lady pointed toward an old rotary telephone sitting in a little nook just inside the main hall next to the beautiful staircase that led to the second floor. Strange, he thought, as his eyes spanned the room, which smelled of fresh cooked pastries mixed with floor wax. Odd yet inviting, all at the same time. Hesitant to use the phone, mostly because he wasn't sure how to operate the antique rotary dial, he figured he'd wait a bit before calling Uncle Red. Maybe the engine just got hot, he thought, and he could let it cool off and then see if it would start. Besides, he could think of no better place on earth to be stranded.
Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Barbara. Barbara Hill.
Nice to meet you, he replied as he found himself hypnotized by her beauty and her smile.
So, do boys from Dallas not have names?
She asked with a curious smile. Oh, I'm sorry, he replied embarrassingly. I'm Hayden. Hayden Hopkins.
Nice to meet you, Hayden Hopkins,
she replied with a slight giggle. I think I'll wait on that phone call and just let the engine cool down a bit, if you don't mind, said Hayden.
Suit yourself,
she said.
You can sit on the porch and relax a bit if you like.
Of which he was more than happy to oblige. He quickly made himself comfortable in one of the large white rocking chairs with thick padded cushions surrounded by big tropical plants as he took note of 2 hummingbirds sipping from the blooms of the crepe myrtles. Barbara sat in the chair next to him, quickly joined by a gray tabby cat, who she affectionately called
Mr. Doodles. Do you go to school?
She asked. Yes, he replied. I do. I just finished my 3rd year at Texas. I'm working on my business degree. What about you? Do you go to school here? He asked her.
I'll be a freshman at Baylor this fall. I can't wait.
The conversation went on, and Hayden was beginning to understand the silly notion of love at first sight. They shared interests and hobbies and each other's goals for life as if time no longer held any meaning. He learned that her father was a physician who had a practice up in Dallas. Her mother stayed home, and her brother Roy was in the Army, a first lieutenant stationed right out of Fort Hood, Texas. And Mr. Doodles? Well, he just walked up to the house one day and they just took him in. They spoke of things like childhood memories, grandparents, and friends, all the while careless of the stress that comes with adulthood and responsibilities. The only thing that suddenly existed for them seemed to be the bliss of the moment. The day evaporated, and Hayden suddenly realized that evening was upon them, and he still had a car problem on his hands. "Wow," he remarked as he noticed it getting dark. "I guess I need to see if that car is going to start. I had no idea that it was this late."
Why don't you see if it'll start now?
She said as Hayden got up toward the car. She followed down the sidewalk, which ran through the manicured lawn to the curb where the car sat. Hayden rechecked the hood to make sure it was closed when he slid into the seat and tried the ignition once again. With one crank, vroom! Just like that, the engine roared to life. Hayden checked the gauges and everything seemed just fine. Curiously, he got out of the car to thank Barbara for her hospitality. "I guess maybe it just got hot or something," he said.
Yeah, cars sometimes do that, I guess.
As she shrugged her shoulders while giggling. "Well, I guess I'd better be getting home," he said nervously. Suddenly, as if again bewitched, he instinctively added, "I sure would love to see you again." Barbara said,
Yeah, me too. I really had a nice time today.
"Would you like to go out next Saturday night?" Hayden nervously asked.
I'd love to.
She said with a huge smile. "Great," he said. "It's a date then. Why don't I pick you up early in the afternoon and you show me around Waxahachie?"
Sounds wonderful to me.
"Can I have your phone number?" he asked. And she said,
Yes.
and made a quick trip back into the house, returning with the number written on a small piece of personalized letterhead that read, "Dr. Lewis Roy Hill, M.D." With that, Hayden walked around the car and got in, leaving the beautiful girl waving goodbye from the sidewalk in front of her beautiful home. Hayden's drive back to Dallas was interrupted by his cell phone. It was Uncle Red inquiring the whereabouts of his classic Corvette and to make sure Hayden was all right. Any punishment handed to him at this moment was irrelevant compared to how he was feeling. He was on cloud 9, floating northbound along a stream of lights toward home, his mind still reeling with the thoughts of the most beautiful girl in the world, in eager anticipation of the time he would spend with her next Saturday night. The week seemed to drag for Hayden. He'd had lots of dates with girls and even had a serious girlfriend in high school. But something about Barbara Hill was different. Just the thought of her made him feel all funny inside. Never before had a girl had this kind of impact on him. Like a 5-year-old waiting for Santa, his thrill and anticipation of seeing her again seemed to grow daily. He could hardly wait. She was all he could think about.
"The number you are calling is no longer a working number,"
was the recorded voice each time he dialed the numbers Barbara Hill had written on the oddly faded piece of paper she'd handed him just days before. Hayden tried the number several times, each with the same results. It was the middle of the week, and he just needed to hear her voice again. And besides, it was proper to confirm the date. But he couldn't reach her by phone. Not to worry, he thought. He'd planned to show up anyway. Nothing was going to keep him from going to Waxahachie. After all, he had a date with the girl of his dreams, and he was going to keep it no matter what. Soon, Saturday arrived, and Hayden, borrowing his mother's SUV, headed south to the small town half an hour south of Dallas in nervous excitement. It was 4 in the afternoon when he pulled up in front of the large Victorian house. But something strange was about. The rocking chairs were missing, as were the plants, and the creep myrtles were missing their blooms. As a matter of fact, the porch was bare and lifeless, with the front door shut, no longer warm and inviting as it was the week before, as dust and dead leaves covered the porch and steps as if no one had been there in weeks or even months. As Hayden walked up the sidewalk, he noticed an elderly man in the lawn next door, stooped over a flower bed. The man looked his way as if curious of his intentions. He continued up the steps to the front door, where he knocked but got no answer. He knocked again until when he was interrupted by the elderly neighbor.
"Can I help you?"
Oddly startled, he replied, No, sir. I'm just here to pick up my date, but it seems that nobody is home."
"Well, young man,"
he replied,
"that could be because nobody lives in this house."
Hayden looked at the old man as if he had lost his marbles. He went on to say,
"No one has lived in the house since 1968. It's owned by Mr. Roy Hill, who lives near Seattle, Washington. I don't think he's actually been here in years. He just keeps the place exactly like it was when he was growing up here. I keep an eye on things for him."
Hayden was dumbstruck and refused to believe what the old man said. Most likely crazy, he thought. "Hey, is this some kind of joke?" he replied. "I just met these people a week ago. My car broke down right there," pointing to the spot at the curb where he had parked the car. "I met the girl who lives here. I walked into the house where I heard her mother in the kitchen. People live here. I saw them. I was here and they were there."
"Young man,"
he replied,
"I never said you didn't see and talk to someone at the house. I simply said no one has lived here for over 40 years.
Hayden looked at him, completely puzzled, when he asked,
"Did you, by any chance, meet a pretty young lady named Barbara, with long black hair, beautiful blue eyes, and sweet as the morning dew?"
"Yes," he said with confusion and excitement. "Yes, that's her. That's Barbara Hill."
"Did she sit on the porch and talk to you and give you a phone number that you couldn't call?"
asked the old man. Hayden was dumbfounded as the man continued with another question.
"Was she wearing a pair of white slacks with a blue sleeveless sweater and a red ribbon holding her black hair?"
"How do you know all of that?" he asked.
"Because, son, you're not the first,"
he said.
"I mean, you're not the first boy who has showed up here for a date with Barbara Hill. Several young men, just like you, have walked up these steps expecting to find a warm and friendly young lady waiting for them at this door. But no one has been at this door in many years, or at least no one living."
Hayden was beginning to question his own sanity and not sure he could believe a word of what this crazy old man was saying.
"The first time it happened was about 1978, 10 years after the plane crash. A young man, just like you, about your age showed up one afternoon to take her out on a date. But naturally, no one was here and hadn't been for some time. He knocked on my door looking for information about my neighbors and young Barbara Hill. I was angry with him at first and told him to leave my property because I thought he was playing a cruel joke. Since that time, there have been several, including you, who came looking for a young, beautiful lady, 40 years dead. Like a magnet from beyond, she continues to come home to this house somehow and mingle with young men who instantly fall for her devilish charm and unending beauty, even in death. I've lived in this neighborhood since 1948, only a couple of years before Barbara was born. I watched her and her brother grow up here, you know. My wife and I were good friends with her parents. You can only imagine the grief when the family died in that plane crash.
Plane crash? What plane crash? He frightfully asked, as his mind wondered if any of this conversation was really happening. He was sure, without a doubt, that he stood upon this very porch not a week ago, falling hopelessly in love with an 18-year-old beauty named Barbara Hill, who was as real as he was and very much alive. The old man continued as he searched his mind for memories.
It was on the 3rd day of May, 1968, when they were headed home on a flight from Houston. The doctor had been to a conference there. He'd decided to take Barbara and her mother along on the trip so the family could spend some time together. The morning was stormy here in Waxahachie, and a line of heavy storms had just passed through. The plane was en route back when the pilot tried to fly through those storms. The plane just came apart in mid-air and crashed to the ground in a fireball near a small town down near Corsicana. There were no survivors.
The conversation was silent as Hayden searched every fiber of his being for something to assure him that things like this didn't really happen. That the ghosts of pretty girls don't come back to break the hearts of boys like him. But he was left with no choice as the facts began to unfold on that strange afternoon. One that would forever plague his mind in wonder and in doubt.
Barbara was a beautiful girl and very witty,
the man continued.
She was so full of life and was looking forward to her first year in college. She was a very popular girl whose young life was tragically taken away. I guess she wasn't ready for that to happen, and somehow keeps trying to go on with life the way she had lived it. Unfortunately, she hasn't figured out yet that she can't.
Once again, another moment of eerie silence caressed the space between Hayden and the old man.
Barbara's older brother, Roy, was serving in the army and was in Vietnam at the time. He came home and buried his family. Roy inherited the home, but never lived in it again. He hires folks to keep it maintained, just like it was when he was growing up, and it's been kept just as it was the day the family left,
he told him as he sadly gazed into the empty yard. He then stared right at him and said,
"You see, son, some things in this world are, well, just strange, like Barbara Hill, and we'll never have the answers to them. I suggest you go on home now and give this some time to sink in. It's best if you don't try to find all the answers in life. You go on now."
With that, the old man turned and sadly walked away, leaving Hayden Hawkins standing on the front porch of the beautiful home where a beautiful girl once lived on a beautiful day in May many, many years ago.